All right. Okay. So today I'm having a short, I think, open-ended discussion with Andrew McLuhan. Primarily, I think for my students in the mass media and mass culture course. It's a third-year course at Nipissing University. Andrew, I think you're froze again. Oh, can you hear me okay? I don't think you can hear me.
Yep, I have you.
Okay, you're back again. Okay, yeah. Although I was thinking, depending upon how things go, it would be nice to just make the video public. With your permission, it's up to you. We don't have to. Depending how things go, maybe we'll talk for like 40 minutes or something like that. So, I was thinking, what can I say in terms of a bio for Andrew? Well, it's difficult because for me, I think, there's certain people who it's almost an insult to give them a bio. I think of, in this case, what people have been doing for, he's obviously very much in my particular field, the work of Slavoj Žižek, where they won't even introduce him anymore. It's like, it really needs no introduction. And in some sense, I think, I don't know if you would agree with me. I presume you won't because you're a very humble person, but I think your work very much speaks for itself. But nonetheless, I'll see if I can say a few things. What I know about Andrew, this is primarily for my students to hear, is that he's done a lot of work teaching for many years on media, occupying something of what I would cautiously refer to as like a para-academic position, weaving in and out of the various institutions, and which is a difficult but also wonderful position to be in. Also doing a lot of editorial work, in my understanding of some like media or communications journals. Seems to have a very nice family life, very dedicated to your family. I see your child come into the frame every now and then, and I relate with that because my child does the same when I'm teaching sometimes. A new book of poetry, I'm going to post a link, so I'm encouraging my students to purchase a copy. It's titled Written Matter. Is that right? Written Matter?
Yep.
Which, for my students, I hope the title resonates for you. Because written matter, what does that mean from a media studies perspective? There it is. Yeah. So yeah, pick up the book, read it. I think it's extremely important. There's also the sort of more obvious stuff to some people, which is that Andrew has the very important duty of maintaining I would say the inventory of Marshall McLuhan's work, also Eric's work, in addition to his own work, which is a heavy burden, but also very important work. I'm sure, I don't know, I can't speak for you, Andrew, but I'm sure you must sometimes get tired of endlessly being tied specifically to the work of your father and your grandfather. You have your own important stuff that you're doing, and you have your own style, and I can see it. For example, I'm just thinking spontaneously now. When Marshall spoke, he spoke, it seemed to me, with conviction, which didn't make him dogmatic with a point of view, but he had conviction when he spoke. You have this modesty and humility in your approach that's really interesting, and it has its own way of affecting people, I think, and me particularly. So, you have your own independent style, I would say. I don't know if you would agree with me. And I would say that Andrew's work is extremely clear and focused and rigorous. And it's it in some sense that also makes it a little bit different. You still have some probing and stuff going on, but there's a clarity to your work that's quite refreshing, I think, to a lot of people. Okay, that's what I'd like to say in terms of something of a bio. I don't necessarily have any particular questions. I have sketched some things that maybe I could turn to if I need to, but perhaps we can begin a little bit to maybe I'd like to hear more about what you're focusing on these days. What's getting your attention?
Sure. Uh, well, thank you, Duane, for having me here to speak to you and your students, and by extension, whoever happens to be listening with you. That could be anybody, I suppose. You may be on some radars, but to address a few things um, you said it must be a heavy burden. Um, in fact, it's neither heavy nor a burden, really. It's an immense privilege, and in my life, this is kind of funny. This came up because earlier I tweeted ignorance, resentment, acceptance, and growing up McLuhan, because when I was a kid, I didn't know anything about it. And then I started to become aware that people knew who my grandfather was and that he was kind of a big deal for a while. And then, when you get a bit older, people start asking you, oh yeah, so what was he talking about? What does the medium as the message mean? And I didn't know, and they could read a book as easily as I could. So I started to resent it, right? Around that time, I joined a punk rock band and I was able to yell and tell people to go F themselves and, all that kind of thing. But then a little bit later, once I started reading, actually it wasn't until my 30s, really. I started reading and traveling with my dad and helping him out. It started making sense for the first time, really. And since then, it's become not a burden or something to resent, but something I believe so much in that it's really a privilege to be able to share it with people. So that's about where I am right now. Maybe in another decade that'll be different. You also called me a para-academic, and I think that's a quite accurate way of describing my situation. I'm not an academic. I don't, again, going back to that resentment phase, I resented academia quite a bit for the way they treated Marshall, which was very poorly at certain stages. But I understand it now with a bit of this. There's much to say about that, and actually that book has not been written of Marshall and academia. But I'm para-academic in that I graduated high school about a year later than most people, because I wasn't interested in school when I was younger. And that was it. No real desire to go to university, except possibly to get credentials to teach. And as it turns out, you don't really need them because people will invite you to come talk to their classes. And that's a wonderful thing. And again, a privilege. I feel very, very keenly the privilege in being able to address students. When I hear so many people presenting McLuhan ideas differently than I would, it's a real privilege for me to be able to come into a space and try to, if not correct, at least put forward my own misapprehensions. So there's that. And then what else? Yeah, poetry is a huge part of my life. I've written poetry since I was a kid, and was pleased to. This book, Written Matter, is a collection of photographs and poems. Each page features a photograph and then a poem. And actually, I wrote them all where I'm sitting. This is my desk here in what was my father's library. And during the pandemic, I'd come from my house, take a photo along the way, and then use it as a kind of jumping off point to write. And sometimes I'm writing really directly to the image, and sometimes it goes somewhere else. But writing in poetry has always been a part of my life since there is I'm saying I may be wrong, but I'm and he he certainly came off that way. He was very sure of himself, and forceful, even a very forceful personality. But he was also a very good listener too, and he paid very close attention to what everybody said and what they did. And he also, it's funny because I've spent a lot of time studying his books, the books in his library, which he annotated. For example, I have a copy here of Ezra Pound's ABC of Reading. And this is a very influential book for Marshall. This was actually one of his copies of it. You see his name there at the top, H.M. McLuhan. And he made notes as he went along. Let's see if I can find an example here for you. Oh, that's a good one. So in the margin there, you can see user as content. So as he went along, he kind of was inspired. Here's the back where all the various notes are listed. He would index everything in the back to make it easier to find it later on. And it's very interesting because, and I've spoken about this quite a bit, but people think of a book as a one-way medium, and it doesn't have to be at all. Marshall certainly didn't treat it that way. He was very much in dialogue with the writers of the books, or the books themselves, however you want to look at it. And a lot of his work, as he said, his work is a footnote to Joyce, or applied Joyce, or a footnote to Innes. And really, a lot of what he did was make connections between things that the authors themselves didn't necessarily see. And I can imagine a lot of the authors did not thank him for it, or were not grateful or welcoming. But that's the lovely thing about a book, is that the author is beyond disagreeing with you, so you can do what you like with it. Anyway, I suppose this is all in response to what you said, and by way of saying that the 10 years or so I've been doing this kind of thing, I've covered a lot of territory, and you necessarily have to, because McLuhan work covers a lot of territory. There's not really anywhere that you can't study the effects of media technology, because everything is affected by media technology. So it's all kind of fair game.
Well, you've certainly earned your 10 years, your tenure. I wanted to hone in on something you said, because you do a lot of poetry. And of course, we know, perhaps my students don't fully know this because I didn't emphasize it quite as much when I gave 2 modules on Marshall McLuhan's work, briefly touching on Harold Innis. And it was this fascination with how would you put it, the malleability of language, or playing with homophonies and wordplay. You seem to be very much interested in that as well. What is it about that that's interesting to you, and why do you think Marshall McLuhan was interested in that so much?
Great question. The difficulty with teaching McLuhan work is that it is so broad. In fact, I'm 2 of 3 parts into teaching understanding media, which started sort of as a challenge, because a lot of introduction to media theory or whatever courses will teach understanding media in like a single class. And so I've been teaching it chapter by chapter in 3-hour classes. It's going to end up being 36 3-hour classes when I'm done, which is kind of crazy. But this comes back to poetry, because Marshall wrote very poetically, and a poem is a sort of condensed thing. It's like concentrated orange juice, that you have to add water to. You, the reader, are the water, to speak metaphorically. But you have to always keep in mind that Marshall comes from poetry, from literature. he was for his entire career employed as a professor of literature. And it's not coincidental or incidental even. It's very much key to understanding his work, because essentially what he did was he took techniques of literary criticism, which he learned in Cambridge University, and applied them outside of poetry and literature and into popular culture, and specifically technology and the effects of technology. And so it should be no surprise that he found out that all our technologies behave the same way that words do. They have the structure of linguistics, which is interesting. And again, considering that he comes from a literature and poetry background, not surprising. But where I fit in that is that I'm very interested in what's practical. And maybe this is because I come from outside academia. I don't have much time for theory. And writing poetry is a very practical way of engaging. My emphasis when I teach the practical parts of McLuhan, training our senses, training perception, learning how to look at technology and culture the way that Marshall did. And that means studying the effects of things, what they actually do, how they operate. So Marshall was also a poet, a different sort of poet, and a performer. His mother was an elocutionist, which is an old word for somebody who used to go around and give dramatic monologues. And she would put on one-woman shows where she would present a Shakespeare play and play all the parts just herself, or read poetry, monologues, all this sort of thing. So Marshall grew up in a very performative household. And that's key to understanding him, because when you look at Marshall giving an interview or on a panel or giving a speech, you're watching a performance, and he was very deliberate. It's interesting to observe Marshall across media, see the Marshall you get when you're listening to an interview, see the Marshall you get when he's on a panel. Look, for example, at the Norman Mailer Marshall McLuhan debate against, for example, Marshall being interviewed by Mike McManus 10 years later. Very, very different things, and very deliberate, because Marshall always either acted as a mirror, in the case of Mike McManus interview, where Mike McManus is this very soft-spoken, slow, questioning guy, and Marshall responds in kind, versus the Norman Mailer debate, where Norman Mailer comes out as a fighter, and Marshall comes out as a very cool, level, reasonable counterpoint. So he was always playing around, and always very conscious of the sensory bias of the medium he was operating in, and responding in kind. And that was kind of his genius in that.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. You mentioned, okay, you came from outside of academia, and I was thinking the students in my class might be interested in, I read, because you sent it in the book that I ordered from you, the autobiography, which I believe I read somewhere before, but I'm not sure, where Marshall was discussing what it means to be born where he was born, the province, the region, but also in Canada. And I wonder so I guess my question is sort of twofold. Do you think that Marshall McLuhan helps us to see in some way what it means to engage internationally, or even within Canada as a Canadian, and why? What is it like? What can you say about that?
Yes, he does. It's interesting. I've done a few thought exercises where, what if Marshall, well, for one thing, imagine, so Marshall went to Cambridge University in the early 1930s. which was actually his second choice. He wanted to go to Oxford, but it was the Great Depression. He didn't get a scholarship to Oxford. He got a scholarship to Cambridge. At Cambridge, he studied under I.A. Richards and F.R. Leavis in this school of criticism, new criticism. It was known as practical criticism. Now, that was a very Cambridge-centric style of criticism. At the same time, there was a completely different movement in literary criticism in Oxford University, which I'm not expert on by any means, but what if Marshall McLuhan had gone to Oxford and studied under that school of literary criticism and not to Cambridge and studied that literary criticism, which was very much focused on not the content, but the form, and on the effect, on rhetoric, essentially, on how things work and what they do. Very interesting outcomes, I'm sure. Similarly, what if Marshall McLuhan hadn't gotten a job at the University of Toronto in the 1940s, or later when he was getting more and more well-known in the 50s even? What if he'd accepted some of the offers from Princeton or Harvard, places that were actively courting him? What if that instead of Toronto? And he very consciously stayed in Toronto because, and perhaps you can relate to this, Duane, as he said, being in a bit of a backwater like Canada affords you a certain amount of freedom. And I know you're moving on from Canada and looking forward to a certain amount of freedom, but perhaps you're leaving some behind as well. Because, for example, Marshall, when he started something called the Center for Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto. And he was eventually given a small building known as the Coach House. It was a coach house from which he operated the center for the rest of his life, essentially. And this very modest building attracted people from around the world. Now, when he was being courted in the 60s, at the height of his fame, he was, I'm sure, offered much grander places to conduct his activities. But he chose to stay in Toronto. And he did that because just the very things he was being offered were also going to change very much the nature of his work. Just because he was allowed a certain amount of space and peace being in Canada. And that's, Marshall talks about it all over the place, but Canada is kind of the quiet neighbor of the United States, an outsider, kind of like me, I guess, if academia is the United States in the metaphor. And being on the outside affords you a certain amount of perspective, which is hard to get from the inside, the forest for the trees and all that. Marshall talks about his growing up in the Western provinces of Canada being the same thing, where you can see for days, that wide open, uninterrupted view and the perspective that it affords. Marshall talked about Canada as being a cultural dew line, distant early warning line. And that's a metaphor which recurs in his work. The dew line, for the younger people in the crowd, being a system of radar installations across the top of Canada that were supposedly to warn of invasion from across the Arctic, should that ever come. And Marshall saw Canada, and I suppose himself, as operating on that kind of basis, being a distant early warning. And in fact, this is something that he picks up from Pound here in ABC of Reading, where Ezra Pound said, I think it's on page 37, that the artist is the antenna of the race. The antenna or the radar. And this is something that frequently pops up in McLuhan work. Marshall places a lot of emphasis on the artist, capital A artist, being the person in society best placed to warn us of the effects of technology, just because they're constantly tuning and retuning their senses in order to experience the new, the novel. And because of that, they have a bit of a head start on the effects of technology, which takes a while for us regular people to catch up to. Now, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to be able to interpret what that means. And that's a skill I haven't managed to master, but it's something Marshall did. And the thing is, Marshall said, I'm very careful to only predict things which have already happened. Or the future of the future is the present. And yeah, he's messing with us a bit, but he's also being very serious. And the crazy thing is that Marshall insisted that he was describing the present, which read to everybody as describing the future, and which today to us, you hear people say, oh, McLuhan, yeah, he was, they'll even call him a futurist or a prophet, he was describing today. I see it all around me now. And the thing is, he was describing his present, which only is obvious to us today. Now, the paradox there, and the thing which frankly disturbs me and should disturb anyone who thinks about it, is if what Marshall was describing as his present in 1960, now 60 years later in 2021 looks like our present, what are we not seeing today? And the answer is everything.
But do you have do you have a sense of what today's prophecies are? Prophecy means to be before speech, doesn't it? Prophet, or before language, something like that. I believe in the etymological sense. I might be wrong, but what do you think? Do we have any indication of where we're at today? I'm leaving it intentionally broad.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you how Marshall did it. One of the things he did, coming back to the arts, is he paid attention to the arts and he paid attention to language, because we use language, it's quite obvious, but we use language to communicate, to describe things, and if we don't have the words, we make them or we repurpose them. Languages are living things, and a lot of people resent this. You get a lot of stodgy academic types even who resent changing usage of language. But it's a very important thing. And Marshall paid very close attention, my father did too, to slang and to how language changes, because we have to change our language in order to describe our changing situations, our changing selves. Dropping of pronouns, for example, this sort of thing, is a hint that big changes are happening in real time. So study the changes. What is changing? And then why? What is that change in reaction to? And that will help answer those kinds of questions.
Speaking of changes, I'm going to go sort of on something that I'm personally interested in. I'd love to hear what you have to say. The changing role of humor. I remember a passage, I can't quote it directly because it's been a while, but where Marshall said, or he wrote, something about education is best when, where I'm going, when there's some humor instead of this sort of. So my question is, it seems to me that humor, it's difficult to have humor in the classroom today. It's very difficult, in fact. And I wonder what you think about this changing status of humor and the sort of sensitivity to jokes today.
Right. Too soon is a phrase you hear. That a situation is too raw to be made fun of. It's too close, it's too soon. We need a bit of distance before that's funny, kind of thing. McLuhan and Humor is another book to be written, a very important book, actually. Marshall died before observational comedy really came along and came into its own, but he would have loved it. He would have loved Seinfeld, because I believe he would have categorized people like Seinfeld as his conception of an artist, because these observational comics are always out there observing. They're looking for new things, for changes. You ever notice how, or isn't it funny how people, or, I was down here the other day, and so a lot of media study can be had by listening to comedy and comedians.
I wonder what you think. When I think of Seinfeld, I can't help but think of Seinfeld, because in episode number 1, forgive me, episode number 1, George Costanza is there and he's saying, "Signs, Jerry, signs." In other words, we didn't talk about this in my class with the students, but the role of the signifier and the crafting of language. But what's happening with the humor in Seinfeld, it's not exactly the crafting of a joke, right? So how is language used there?
Seinfeld, that's brilliant. An interesting exercise might be to go take a couple Seinfeld episodes and cut out the laugh track, and then see just how funny it is. I think you'll find that the laugh track is usually there to remind you that it's appropriate to laugh here. It's a quirk of television and the screen thing that it's difficult to know when to laugh, and even in live audiences they have that applause sign coming to remind the audience to applaud, so that the people back home know that this is funny or something to celebrate. That's interesting. But Marshall used comedy as a technique in his speaking. For example, he was always collecting jokes, and he used them when he gave a talk. He'd usually open a talk with a joke or two. For example, he'd say, "Now, before I speak, I'd like to say a few words." These kind of little subtle things, and then he'd maybe throw in a joke. And the idea was to get the crowd loose and not so serious. And then he'd launch into talking about acoustic and visual space, or the meeting is the message, or whatever. And he'd go along for a little while until he felt he was losing them, and then he'd crack some more jokes, right, to put them off balance a little bit.
But if I may, Andrew, apologies for interrupting. Do you think that works today?
Definitely.
You think it still works?
Sure.
Approach? Because I can imagine, a person at the University of Toronto cracking a joke to try and get attention, and it just, I can't imagine, personally, I can't imagine it working so well unless there's a certain awareness of I'll give you an example of what sort of humor I tend to see in academia. Forgive me, students, please. The sort of humor that I see in academia is a sort of like, it's a humor where you're supposed to laugh because we're all supposed to know that this reference is important. So it's not a humor that sort of introduces, let's say, a novelty or a latent sort of idea that we weren't prepared to accept or something like that. It's sort of like, well, Nietzsche wouldn't say that, and then everybody laughs because they want to be included in the awareness of the Nietzsche reference or something like that. These are the sorts of humor, that's the sort of humor that I tend to see in the university today. I don't see a lot of this other stuff working.
Well, it's a subtle way to maybe win the crowd over a little bit, get them laughing with you, and maybe you disarm them a little bit from being so argumentative. Marshall used jokes a few different ways, though. He used them to disarm. He also used them to educate. For example, he had one that he pulled out from time to time, and this is actually a good one. I still use it. You know, there's two goats, and they're out behind a Hollywood production studio, and they're chowing down on some old film reels. And the one goat's chewing on something, and the other says, "Oh, what do you have there?" He says, "Oh, it's Gone with the Wind." And the other goat says, "Oh yeah, how do you like that?" He says, "Well, the book was better." Okay, it's funny, but it's funnier. It's funnier in a McLuhan context when you're talking about media. He also had some about Russia that he used from time to time, which I can't recall off the top of my head. I'll try and find them and send them to you or something. But yeah, humor, and it's interesting about the deployment of humor in person versus in a screen to screen kind of context. For example, I have no idea if anybody laughed at that little joke I just said, and I think it took you a second to.
There was a little lag on my screen. That's why it took a second. A little latency. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, McLuhan and humor is a very interesting category, and something that I pay attention to because they're working so hard to pay attention.
Mhm.
If you step back a little bit from the end result, which is they're trying to get you to laugh or have a good time or whatever, there's a lot that can be learned there. I'm trying earnestly to get in touch with Joe Rogan. I think he would be a fascinating person to talk to because he's really into comedy. You know, he's also seems to be into media studies. He'll drop McLuhan a little bit here and there, as will some of his guests. Yeah. For example, Jordan Peterson, who's been on a couple times.
I saw a few of those.
Yeah. I've watched a little bit, but honestly, as much as it'd be cool to talk to Joe Rogan, like hours and hours and hours, not so much my thing.
Let's see what we can do. Let's see if
right.
somebody that who might watch this might be able to set up that. I think that would be a wonderful conversation to
I think so too.
to watch. I wanted to ask you. I know we're beyond the 40 minutes, but I think my students would be interested in this. I think in one of my classes I gave an anecdote, and I'd love to hear how you might interpret this anecdote, if you don't mind humoring me a little bit. It would, I spent 2 years in India, and I went to India, to put it really naively, with sort of Western sensibilities, thinking I was, had some sort of a liberal, tolerant attitude, and this sort of idea. And I went to a McDonald's. Don't judge me, people. I went to a McDonald's, and immediately at the McDonald's, at this giant luxury mall, there's no lineup. Everybody's gathered around the cash register, and I'm like saying, "Hey, I've been waiting here." And then they get to me, they ask me my order. I'm only able to say the first part. Then he points at another person, and so going all around. And I remember something similar, but not to the same degree, when I lived in the Middle East for a short time. And I thought, there's nothing sequential about this, like what's going on here? And why is it that when I'm in, McDonald's here in Canada, it's, if I don't get, you got to go in the lineup and you go one by one at a time. But the thing is, it was really efficient. I later realized it was an extremely efficient system because, yeah, it might have taken me a little longer to get what I wanted, but it felt a bit more egalitarian because everybody was helped. And the idea that they could so easily remember what was going on all around there. How would you interpret what's happening there?
Well, that's very interesting. Actually, I touched about this. I think you were listening to the radio segment. I do this radio segment every Saturday afternoon for like 10 or 15 minutes. And I touched on visual versus acoustic space. And Marshall used these very broad categories in many ways in talking about cultures and their orientation to the senses. In North America, where our society is largely based on the alphabet and the printed word, we're very visual oriented, very sequential, A, B, C, D, the eye which sees things in sequence, one at a time. We have a field of view. There's some periphery, but mainly it's a single point of view. And there's a relation there versus what he called acoustic space, or the sense of space experienced by the ear, which the ear hears from all directions at once. And we can focus in a little bit. You'll see people doing this. But generally, we hear from all directions at once versus seeing in single directions. And in cultures which don't have which aren't really forced into perspective by literacy and the eye, you have generally a more wide open field. So your experience, for example, in India, which their culture is not based on the alphabet quite as much, although the Brits gave a good kick at it for a while there. So they have different ways of doing things, and it seems utterly foreign and uncomfortable to a Westerner like us, brought up on sequentiality. But it does seem to work for them.
Thank you so much. I had another sort of anecdote that I mentioned, and maybe I'll conclude here because I'm demanding to. I could listen to you talk for a very long time, but I had this crazy idea once that the American election, I mean the one when it was Trump and Hillary Clinton, mm-hmm. I had this crazy idea that it had, the election didn't have a lot to do with who was the better candidate, You
think?
Because, well, obviously, like Hillary Clinton, it seemed to me, what I did one time was I pulled up her Twitter feed, the Twitter feeds. This was before Donald Trump lost his tweeting abilities. And I put them side by side for some students when I was teaching in Michigan. And I said, tell me what's going on here. What's the difference? And what my students came up with was just, I thought, quite brilliant. They said when they read Hillary Clinton's Twitter feed, it was like she was giving a report to her professors. Yeah. She would have a whole bunch of posts, and it would be like, it would be a threaded together argument that's quite linear and a fact, a point, a point of view. Yeah. And she had wonderful grammar. She must have had a proofreader or something. But Trump, of course, in the same sentence, sometimes he would contradict, what Freud called kettle logic. I didn't fire Comey. Comey was already fired, and so on. He didn't seem to care about this linearity, this sequential way of talking. He didn't care so much about grammar. He was using a lot of uppercase and capitals and a lot of acronyms and stuff like that. And he would write, it seemed, in haste. You remember the Kafafi incident? He would write in haste. Unlike Clinton, it seemed premeditated, mm-hmm. in a sense, an exposition of her knowledge. Yeah. And Trump not so much caring about being seen as a person who knew something. I just wonder what you might have to say about that. Am I totally crazy here?
You're not totally crazy. Well,
just a little bit.
Judge. You're more able to judge than I think, but and apparently Hillary Clinton has read Understanding Media, but unfortunately, I don't think she got much from it. Donald Trump, on the other hand, while I doubt he would remember ever hearing the name Marshall McLuhan, is more the McLuhanite than Hillary. Part of this has to do with Steve Bannon, who's a very smart guy, and I've seen some interviews where he drops some pretty serious McLuhan-esque media theories. He knows exactly what's going on. Trump, I think, is more of a savant than a student. He seems to have an innate kind of feel for
stable genius,
right? But exactly, like Twitter, like I don't think you ever saw Donald Trump do a thread on Twitter. You know, like you see people blah 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 thread 1 of 57. Trump's not about to do that. That's print thinking, you know, logical, connected, sequential, the world of the I, which is all about logic and reason and efficient cause. You know, let's not get into causality, but you know, A is to B is to C, and then you get D, you know. Whereas Trump's more like A, F, G, Z, Y, K, W, whatever, you know. And the thing is, we don't live in a print-based world anymore. The United States maybe was formed on a print-based world, is the first country in the world to really come into print in a serious way. But print isn't running things anymore. And Trump, even if he didn't know this, understood it, and definitely acted that way. And the election was his to lose. There was seemingly nothing he could possibly do to lose that election. And he didn't lose that election. Hillary lost the election, and it was hers, actually. I really believe if she had changed her approach a little bit, she could have won it pretty easily, because let's face it, Donald Trump leaves a lot to be desired and should be admired. Hillary, or appealing candidate, but you know, she's trying to give a visual presentation in an acoustic world, basically. And so it fell on deaf ears to mix metaphors completely. And she kept appealing to reason, into logic, you know, which people that it matters, and unfortunately, it doesn't matter too much. So I mean, that's and you would think people learned that the first Trump election, but they didn't. And it's a minor miracle that Biden took the election, honestly.
I remember, though, Marshall commented upon an American election in the past, and the difference was he thought they were both totally inattentive to the media as environment. In this case, we have what did you, savant? Savant.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew, sorry, did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, that's fine. You know, I could talk to you all afternoon as well, Duane, and I'm upset that we didn't get a chance. So close yet so far. You're up there in North Bay, and I'm just a couple hours south in Prince Edward County. But hopefully, we'll have a chance to meet in the future.
I really hope so. It's a privilege to know you. It's an honor to have you. And I mean that wholeheartedly. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I look at my notes. It's not an index. It's something like, I don't know. It looks like a map, I think. A cognitive map, perhaps.
Well, that's better than my notes.
That's because I don't have too much to contribute, because you have so very much that we want to hear.
Actually, I did come up with one thing. I don't know if you can read that.
Algorithmically is the ear organically.
Is the new organically.
Is the new organically. Ah,
Yeah. Well, it actually came back to that radio thing I did, because I always make a song request. And I was playing a song for my kids. They're into kind of punk rock and stuff, which because I'm into punk rock and stuff. But I was playing for them the song by Quiet Riot, "Come On, Feel the Noise." And the next song that came up on YouTube was "We're Not Gonna Take It" by Twisted Sister. And you would almost think that came up organically, except that it came up algorithmically, right?
mm-hmm.
So hence algorithmically is the new organically, because we think, oh, that's cool. What a coincidence, or that kind of came up organically, but it's the algorithm at work. So digital digital happenstance is manufactured, and I'm reminded of this because it's the difference between looking up things online on Google, browsing the internet. An internet browser is what, I don't know if we still call them that, a browser, right? Versus browsing in person. And one of my favorite things to do, I'm speaking to you from my father's library, for example. It's around 6,000 books. And you can browse the shelves. Or you can go into a library, and this is what I like to do when I'm looking for a book to read. I go into a library and I just look around, browse the shelves. It's a very different experience when mediated by a computer, which is working on information it knows about you or thinks it knows about you and putting things in your way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Very, very different experiences, but we think about it in terms of a sort of digital serendipity than we think. So one of my favorite ways to find a new book to read is I go into the library, I start browsing. And I do judge book by their covers. I'm talking about nonfiction, fiction books here. I'm really into detective fiction. And they tend to oftentimes have flashy kind of covers. So I'll pick up a book and, that looks interesting. And a little trick that I've found is when I find authors know each other, and they have author friends, and they get their author friends to write blurbs on their books. So what I like to do when I found an author that I like, I look at their books and I look at who's written blurbs for them. And, and that's how I find, oh, well, these authors know each other and they're into each other's work. If I like this guy, I'll probably like this person, and I found a lot of interesting authors that way, actually. But this is maybe the difference between analog and digital browsing, or I wonder what video will come up online after this one.
Yeah, I was about to say, because I was talking to a person on Facebook recently and I said, how do we have 800 something friends in common? If you like this person, you might like that. But I was also thinking, I don't know why I was provoked by this while you were speaking, because I tend to be provoked by personal experience quite often. I can't help it. It makes me less of an academic, perhaps. But, I was once married in the Middle East. And the way that marriages tend to happen there is, of course, an arranged marriage. And over here, a lot of the people, when they heard of this, they got really disturbed. And I said, at least in the arranged marriage, there's a sense in which the person is looking out for you. They have, it's the person's father or mother or whatever helping them out. You have some veto power. Here, your relationships are arranged by an algorithm, by Tinder and Bumble and so on. And there's something colder about that. I should plug my friend. He's a Canadian scholar, by the way. Perhaps you've heard of him, who wrote a book titled Algorithmic Desire, Matthew Flisfetter, which is a wonderful book. But so I sort of identify a little bit with what you're saying. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Duane, it's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day, and thanks for doing this.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.